and welcome back to the NCMU podcast, where we are dedicated to raising up and equipping the next generation of nerd culture ministers and missionaries. I am joined today with York Moore, the president of the Coalition for Christian Outreach. He's got a whole bunch of different things and titles and stuff that he's done. He's also going to be one of our keynote speakers at Nerd Culture Ministry Summit this year. York, welcome to the show. We're so glad to have you.
Hey, glad to be with you, brother.
York, give us like the 10,000 foot with like all of the other things that you've done. You're an author. You haven't just worked as the president of the CCO. You've also worked for a lot of other organizations. But on top of that, you've also done a tremendous amount of awesome justice work and teaching and things, outside of just what you've done professionally.
Yeah, it's been a wild ride, especially as an ex-atheist. Didn't grow up as a Christian, came to Christ at the University of Michigan, Go Blue, and went into business for several years before going into nonprofit work. And 27 of those years, I was with InterVarsity Christian Fellowship, wonderful ministry on campus. I was as their national evangelist, and in that role, did about 15 years of anti-trafficking work, working with political leaders all throughout the country, Fortune 100 companies, NGOs here and in Cambodia. Did a lot of anti-trafficking work here in D.C., all the way from California to New York, even at the Ohio State University, because Buckeyes need the message too, probably more than Wolverines. and then most recently, before coming on as the president of the CCO, helped start a movement called the Every Campus Movement, which is about 130 organizations really seeking God for revival on our 4,169 college campuses in the United States. And we started that back in 2017, and we have to date prayer walked on every single college campus in America, seeking God for revival. So yeah, I've been involved in a bunch of different stuff, but the unifying theme is that Jesus belongs everywhere. He belongs in the courtroom. He belongs in the locker room. He belongs in the sports stadium, in the college campus, and in digital spaces, which is what we're going to talk about here today. And anywhere where there is suffering or injustices, that is God's invitation for us as Christians to make heaven on earth. Thy will be done on earth as it is in heaven. And so that's really the unifying theme through the very, messy past 30 years of my work.
You mentioned that you weren't a believer, became a believer whenever you were in college. We can get into a little bit about your background, but to get into a little bit of that, you've also been a gamer throughout most of your life. So just tell us a little bit about that as you tell us a little about kind of your background, maybe a little your upbringing.
Yeah, for sure. I credit video games for keeping me out of prison and keeping me off drugs and out of gangs. I grew up homeless on the streets of Detroit, and when we got out of homelessness, took on gaming real hard. This is way back in the 1900s when you had to go to the arcades. And, I've actually had surgery for my love for video games. I had a cyst as a result, but just love games, man. I had some world records in the 80s, old games, Defender, Stargate, Joust, Galaga. It's all of the games I just love, and I'm still an active gamer. I have 5 consoles in the household, and I'm not a PC gamer. I still love consoles. I want my machine to do one thing and one thing only, and I want it to do it well in a predictable way. It's probably because I'm old. So it's nothing because, it's not because I'm superior or anything like that. I need things to be simple.
We can't all join the master race, okay? That's right.
My bias these days are still like the old Black Ops zombies, like Buried and, all of the ones on Black Ops 3, Reisendrach. I love doing the Easter eggs at Tsunoshima. So, yeah, I just love games, man. They just unlock worlds within worlds, and they just seem to be getting better and better and better. I'm probably one of the few people that's super excited for the next Black Ops. I think the zombie mode looks incredible. So yeah,
I've heard lots of positive things about it.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like anytime. I think Treyarch is bringing us back to round based. That's my hope. Like round based zombies with a good Easter egg. Like, just stop giving us this crazy, endless. They're trying to make it look too much like a campaign. Just give us a classic zombie game, or just even remaster something like Buried. I keep my PS3 simply because I want to play Buried on a machine, and that's a dedicated Black Ops buried maps machine, a whole machine devoted to one map.
That's all that it does. It knows how to play that. It knows how to get nowhere else. It just goes to Black Ops. It goes to that map and it plays that map.
That's exactly right.
Well, York, you and I have been really building a friendship over the last year or so. And we've said that NCMS is about nerd ministry. And so, yeah, at Nerd Culture Ministry Summit, we're going to be talking Dungeons and Dragons. We're going to be talking video games. We're going to be talking live streaming. We're talking all the stuff that you would think would be classical nerd stuff. But it's also in some ways been a sort of like a safe haven for the people who are thinking really outside the box whenever it comes to digital space and digital ministry. So a couple episodes ago, we had Jay Kendra from the online pastor at Saddleback, who came on the show and talked about his most recent book coming out and Saddleback's exploration into virtual reality and his heart just for reaching people where they are, which was just incredible and beautiful. And I think one of the things that drew us together was something very similar. And so uniquely enough, York actually met at Lux, our video guy, our video director, Greg First. He was shooting a Coalition for Christian Outreach event, and he and York connected. And I suspect that in that particular room, Greg was kind of like your safe haven to talk about the things that you were most excited about at the time, which was digital. So you've written an article. You just came back from speaking, doing a workshop at an AI conference in Vegas, which is super, super cool. So talk to me a little bit about your interest in digital ministry and digital space. Like, why is that so intriguing to you, and why do you find it to be so important?
Yeah. Well, right before I became a Christian at Michigan, my plan was to go to MIT for artificial intelligence. Now, this was in 1991. So AI has been around for a long time, but it was a conceptual study course. Physics and philosophy and computer science were all converging at that time. But now here we are, like living in the early days of what I think will actually be one of the most meaningful changes to the lived human experience in all of human history. That's how big this moment is that we're in. And so because of my passion for AI, I've just followed the industry all of these, 30 years. And, here we are. Now we're actually able to engage with agents or large language models. And I think the potential for human flourishing, the potential for the gospel is going to be incredible. But I want to press one layer deeper than that. And I would say that the reason why digital is so important to me is because it's not simply a set of tools. We've thought too small. And certainly, the rise of the internet and then mobile has provided lots of tools. We're much more productive. We can check in at the airport using a QR code on our boarding pass. We can do online banking. But I think by and large, people have thought about digital simply as a set of tools, like your tool shed has a shovel and a pickaxe, at least mine does. And we take up the right tools for the right job. And I'd like to say that what we've created is actually something that is much more beautiful and powerful than just a set of tools. We've actually created a realm. And the realm is a space where we've extended what it means to be human into this space, and we are now incarnating ourselves within this realm. And within this realm are other beings, other human beings, other artificial minds, and I think it won't be long until we stop using the word artificial and we'll just refer to them as some other thing. Right now, the language of agents and LLMs is very popular in generative AI space, but we're at the beginning. But I'd like to argue that in this space, there are also other minds that are from heaven. God is there, for instance. God himself has already occupied the digital space. And many, many people actually have encounters with God himself in digital spaces. We also know that the demonic and the angelic forces are there as well. So everything that happens in the corporeal, philosophic word corporeal, the physical space, has now been extended into this digital space. It's not simply a set of tools, it's a place. And if that's true, theologians use a phrase called sphere sovereignty to refer to the fact that Jesus is Lord over every square inch of creation. Now, creation actually extends into this digital realm. Being made in the image of God, God gave us the power to create as he has created. Not ex nihilo, we can't create something out of nothing, But we've taken the gifts and the resources that God has given us, and we've created something that is a spinning world of wonder. Now, is it broken by sin? Absolutely. Every square inch of this world has been damaged by sin, but God is in the process of redeeming things, and he will make all things new in the world to come. And if that's true, this is where I'll land a plane, Mark. If that's true, then what redemptive purpose for human flourishing and for the glory of God does the digital space represent? It's a vast, immense opportunity for Christians to think more Christianly about what it means to have a digital self and to experience God and experience others in this digital realm that we have created.
York, one of the things that I love about our conversations is, and I've said this from the beginning, and York doesn't like it, but that's okay. York is like so much more in terms of intelligence, like his IQ is so much higher than mine, and so I get the opportunity to learn so much from him whenever we talk. And in the reality is, right, like in so many ways with what we're doing at Lux, we're experiencing those same things from a very different angle and would communicate them in similar things in different ways, right? Because it's very practical, so sort of like very boots on the ground, very experiential. And you've come to a very similar set of conclusions from a spot of just like philosophically, like you've thought about these things, you've examined them and seen. And so like, what are the things that we say? And I have a question for you about this in terms of like space, because there are going to be people who are generationally different. And there are going to be people who think of space, digital things as tools still, right? And to be fair, so did I. I mean, growing up, experiencing high-speed internet in the house for the first time, the app that I download that makes it easier for me to commute back and forth down the turnpike, the thing that I can just park with the app in my phone in Pittsburgh instead of having to put money and keep changing. There's tools that make life more convenient. And I think that the older you are and the more sort of like non-plastic or the more concrete your brain was when you experience the internet, the more likely you are to use it as a tool. And my experience has been that the younger you are, the more plastic and forming your brain was whenever you experienced high-speed internet, which right now, right, for Gen Z, Gen Alpha, the oldest of Gen Zs, like what, 20-ish right now, Gen Alpha, my daughter's age, who've swum it. They've just been swimming in it, right? They don't know anything different. They live there. They do use tools just the same as I live at my house, and I also use a frying pan. There are tools there, but I also occupy and live in that space. And so I'm interested for your take. Do you think it's just a matter of aha moments that every person could get there? Or is there a certain reality in which just the younger you are, the more capable you are of occupying this newly created space? Is there a certain point in which people are incapable of occupying this newly created space and not using it as just a tool?
Yeah, and we have to ask the question underneath the question: what does it actually mean for the lived human experience to actually occupy this space? And so, to be sure. So let's take my mom, for example. She's 86. She can barely turn her smartphone on. Sometimes I have to drive down to her facility and actually help her simply unmute the phone. She's not going to have a lived human experience that's enhanced through occupying this digital realm. That's an esoteric thought. And so certainly there's an adoption curve. It's going to be much easier and more natural for people who've grown up digitally to adopt a posture that's holistic and integrated. And that's what I would be arguing for, is that we think Christianly and we orient our lives, not thinking that digital is something that is bad or corrupting what it means to be human. It only does that because we've not thought Christianly and holistically about it. So as we integrate this into our lives and we think Christianly about it, the way in which we manifest in digital spaces is very much like me thinking about maybe living in Kentucky. Now, I don't live in Kentucky. I live in the great state of Michigan. But nobody in Kentucky would wake up and say, you know what? It's so sinful living here. This is just, the dirt here is just staining my soul, right? Nobody thinks like that.
Sure.
A space is benign. Now, the digital space has actors that are not benign, that are evil. All right. There's persecution and exploitation. There's manipulation. We think about all the antitrust and all the legal issues around privacy rights and those kinds of things. It is not a benign place because there are moral agents at work in the digital space. The digital space itself is neither moral or immoral. It's been damaged by evil, but that evil has infiltrated the space through moral agents, primarily human beings, who've brought their own sinful desires and patterns. And so when we think about what it means to actually have a digital self, a few years ago, there was a phrase people like to talk about, our digital footprint. And usually what they meant by that is how we show up on various platforms.
Sure. But what's your social media presence like? Yeah.
Right. Yeah. But I think we need to think more holistically, and I think COVID was a great gift because it forced the majority of the world to actually take that seriously for the first time. Now, let me ask this question. Were human relationships less real because they were mitigated through digital means during the pandemic? I don't think so. In fact, if anything, I was able to have more meaningful relationships with more people through digital means than I was having. That's just me personally. I know some people would say, well, that's not my experience. But you have to admit that real, meaningful, transformative relationships are possible in the digital space. And now I think they're possible for more people in more places than ever before.
Well, we talked about that a decent amount, maybe not on this podcast ever, but when I'll sit down and I'll talk with a pastor or something, and they'll say, well, it's not really real, or relationships aren't real. And I one of the things that I point out is we're all digital and physical. We all walk between those worlds, just because York and we've been together physically a couple of times now, but the vast majority of our relationship and friendship has been developed and built through Zoom, through calls. Those things that we've shared and engaged with aren't illegitimate just because they've been done over a video call. In the same way, if you have an employee wherever it is that you work and you tell the employee, I need you to do X, Y, and Z, send them an email and tell them to do it. When you meet them the next time and they say, oh, I didn't do it because it was over an email, and that doesn't count because it's technology, it's digital, I didn't think you were serious, you wouldn't accept. That's not an acceptable answer. You wouldn't find that to be an acceptable answer. And so you do value what digital can do, and you do value digital relationships. We all do. And we all have our relationships move seamlessly between those two. I think the place where most people struggle is the jump to a relationship that you've only known digitally. Right? People, as long as people can meet with you physically, the relationship can check a box and in some way become real, which kind of brings me to what you were doing in the pandemic on TikTok. I'd love to talk about that a little bit if you're willing to, York, about your presence on TikTok and what you were doing there.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, during the pandemic, as an evangelist, I'm used to getting on planes, speaking to audiences, small and large, all over the country. And when the pandemic hit, that all came to an end. I mean, I had a year and a half of bookings evaporate in less than 72 hours. And so after just sitting around hoping that things would return back to normal, which is just such a phrase, I want us to get that out of our vocabulary. We're never going back to pre-pandemic normality, and we shouldn't actually desire to do so for lots of reasons. But I got sick and tired of waiting to preach the gospel. So a friend of mine said, hey, you should jump on TikTok. And I said, whoa, I don't think anybody wants to see my dance moves. And, the platform had obviously grown quite a bit beyond dancing and whatnot. And so I said, oh, what do I have to lose? And so I jumped on platform, started preaching just very basic Bible messages. But I had a persona. I had written up a persona, the kind of kid that I was speaking to and the kinds of things that he would be struggling with and what he's wondering about. And sure enough, the algorithm began to feature my content to just such a user, a 14-year-old male, predominantly male, with a number of different things that would be true of him. And my account took off. I mean, I was amazed. The first time I hit 10,000, 20,000, 50,000 followers, I thought, well, this is incredible. I mean, I got to do more. And then I was seeing people come to faith in Christ, responding in the DMs, in my lives. People were making professions of faith. They were having encounters with the Holy Spirit, which was just super powerful. And I got 100,000, 200,000, 300, 400,000. Then I started paying attention to the metrics on the back end. And I started asking myself, how can I use the data to actually become a better Bible preacher to this 14-year-old kid that lives in my mind? How can I do that? And so just to give you a simple illustration, I started noticing that there was probably about a 70% scroll away, phenomenon at a very specific point in my preaching. So if I'm preaching on camera like this, and I'm having eye contact with you, and all of a sudden I look down to read the Bible, all of a sudden that simple act of actually breaking eye contact produced a 70% scroll away phenomenon.
Wow.
So I said, well, I'll just fix that. I'll put on a teleprompter on my phone, the verses, and I'll read the verse while I'm not breaking contact. And sure enough, engagement, it doubled. Instead of 70%, it was a 30% drop off. And so, I began to use that. I had a couple of videos go viral, 1 million, 2 million views. And at one point, I was up to about 720-something thousand followers. But much, much more important, because, TikTok's an outreach platform. And, the numbers aren't very impressive. I don't really care about followers. It's really about engagement. Now, followers is a part of the engagement quotient, to be sure. So followers are important. But what's more important is a person who's going to come back day after day after day to consume content and engage with a content creator who's giving them the word of God, challenging them to live moral lives, challenging them to submit their lives to the Lordship of Christ. And that was just a beautiful thing. I mean, I was seeing hundreds of thousands of people self-report that they had prayed a prayer of salvation. And many of them would tell me, I'm going to church now because of you. I'm getting baptized now because of you. I was boarding a cruise ship earlier this year, and the kid that lived in my brain, all of a sudden he materialized in the flesh. I'm checking in for the cruise ship, and here's this 14-year-old kid. He says, hey, are you York Moore? And I'm like, yeah. He said, you changed my life on TikTok. Can we get a picture? And I'm just like, and I've had a few of those kinds of experiences where I've been around. I've since taken a break from TikTok. I'll be going back to it shortly. But, it's just that's just one story. I mean, yeah. I know content creators who have been on platform, preaching Christ, mentoring people, discipling people for years. And I don't think, here's the last thing I'll say, Mark. I don't think that in the future, we're going to actually call those people digital missionaries. We're just going to call them missionaries. Mm-hmm. It should be a foregone conclusion that doing gospel ministry in 2024 is going to integrate our digital self. It's going to integrate digital spaces. It's going to leverage the tools and the access to this realm that give us meaningful connection to people. And there are lots of ministries that are doing that full time. Their only ministry is digital ministry. I mean, a few years ago, we would have laughed at something like that. And now it's becoming par for the course.
Yeah, and even becoming embraced, accepted, expected. I love your intentionality around having a profile of an individual, knowing what that individual is going to be thinking about, knowing what's going to be pressing on their minds and what they're going to be worried about. And then beyond that, I love that intentionality around looking at the statistics. A lot of us, we pull up our Twitch stats or we pull up our whatever, and it's just like, okay, yeah, we take a quick glance through the numbers, but we don't take a long enough time to look at the data to understand the value, to see, okay, this is where we're losing people. And to be able to nail it down to this is the second that I looked away, to notice that's when people, that is so intriguing, so engaging, so interesting to me. To have you nail it down just to wow, if I look away from the screen, people scroll away. If I want people to stick, I got to keep looking at the screen. Got to grab a teleprompter from my phone. Such a simple fix that for the vast majority of us who are just less intentional, we would miss. We would never know that's why 70% of people, we would just say, oh, it's because I'm reading the Bible. We wouldn't pick up on the engage, which is another reason, York, that is so important, I think, if you're a church leader and you're listening to this, to understand engagement and understand why you're not seeing engagement. The moment you were there for people who were strictly online. It's not like you had a room full of people, right? It's just you sitting at your desk, probably live on TikTok. And the moment people thought he might not be here for me, he's looking somewhere else, they were swiping away. Imagine how much easier it is to disengage, just consume, or to click away from your church experience or your live stream experience if people think you're there for the people in the room and you aren't there for them.
That's right. But I'm glad you said that. I go to a wonderful church, and, the church that I'm at now takes digital engagement much more seriously than the church that we were at before I moved away. At the previous church, it was exactly that kind of thing. The pastor or the person giving the announcements, they would say, and for those of you watching online, ooh, I hate that phrase. Just the subtlety of you're a spectator watching what's really happening in the real room. That's just like, we make comments like that all the time that kind of in an offhanded way denigrate, like you're not having the real experience because we're in the room. Now, let's be honest. There are things that can only happen in the corporeal that can't happen in the digital. But that number of things is actually dwindling, I think, by the day. Church I go to now will say things like, for those of you who are with us on our online campus, like you are with us, you're on mission with us, and the online is actually a campus of our ministry. That's a beautiful thing. I'll give you another example of the back-end metrics that really helped me engage. So I started noticing a strange pattern that, most of my followers and engagement were in the United States by far, but I wanted to know where in the United States. And so on the back-end metrics for TikTok, you get your viewers and engagement, and so I started noticing there were a ton of people from Texas. I'm like, what? Why are people watching me from Texas? And so I began to look at when I was posting and when prime time was. And, the algorithm is much more sophisticated and all that. But I think I was actually saying some things in some videos that had much more relevance for being featured in places like Houston that were going through catastrophic events, people looking for hope. It was during times of catastrophe in certain regions. I'll give you another same story. I started noticing 10% of my views were from South Africa, Cape Town area. And I've been there, and it's probably the most beautiful place I've ever been. But I'm like, well, that's odd. Why are people from Cape Town watching my TikToks? Why are 10% of this 400,000 views in this video coming from Cape Town? And so, I'm looking at the news and I'm noticing, well, they're going through their shopping malls being burned down. There's political upheaval. And it's during times of when people are disrupted. They find themselves on their devices alone, lonely, wondering about the world, wondering about purpose. And wouldn't you know, the algorithm features content of hope and content of direction and purpose. And, I'd like to talk about the eschatology or the end times a lot. And so that grabs people's attention, particularly when they think the world is coming to an end.
Yep.
They want to hear videos about when the world is coming to an end. And so I think there are a lot of things that if you pay attention, you can increase your engagement. And that's what it's all about. It's less about followers and it's more about how are we actually forming disciples through meaningful digital engagement. That's why I love what you guys are doing. You guys are like in people's lives. You're in community. You're intentional. You've gone to where people are at, and you've taken engagement as your primary metric, and you've driven toward that. You've driven toward meaningful life transformation through engagement.
Yeah. Well, one of the things that you said during that, York, that I think is really interesting is it shows a shift in the way humanity processes trauma, and the way humanity searches for answers. Because it wasn't that long ago where if there was political upheaval, catastrophic events that were going on, that you went to church, right? Like something happened that was really bad in your community and churches saw a huge uptick of people in them that weekend. There was tension in culture. People went back to church, or people went to family. They went back to connection. But in a world that's more isolated and there's less and less trust in religious figures, certainly less and less trust in sort of spiritual religious organizations, the people are looking for hope in other places. They haven't stopped looking for answers. They haven't stopped looking for hope. They're asking the same questions. The questions have never changed. But the places that they're going to look for answers to that has changed. And what's interesting is that the TikTok algorithm is more onto that than the church is in many cases. Like the TikTok algorithm knows that the best way for them to profit is to ship content that people want. And they know that people who are going through crisis or difficulty want things that make them feel good and hopeful, and they will gravitate towards it. So let's send that to them. I think that's a really interesting, I'm sure they're flicking through and they're seeing you talking about eschatology and making all things new directly in between two slides of puppies who are going down slides or something like that, right? Because the algorithm is shipping them things that are hopeful. And so I just think that's really intriguing. As we get ready to sort of land the plane, York, I know you're going to be at NCMS. You're going to talk a little about this. Talk to me, because what I love is like your brain is never here, right? Like your brain, like we're in 2024. York's brain is in like 2064. And so like your brain's always out there somewhere, but you live in that place in like a continual state. Like for some people, they visit that place. For you, you wake up there and that's just where you are. And you can seamlessly be in these conversations and also be in 2064. So tell me a little bit about what you're seeing, especially coming out of this AI conference you were just at. How do you see technology really shaping the way that we as human beings connect to other human beings in powerful, impactful ways in which we can share the gospel, develop relationships, and see lives transformed?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I'm not a prophet or the son of a prophet, and so I don't have definitive answers. But coming away from AI4, which was the conference, it's the largest independent AI conference in North America, about 5,000 people, venture capitalists, people in the banking industry, CTOs, CIOs, CEOs. It was just a phenomenal time. Executive Vice President of AWS, one of the presenters. I mean, just top line communicators, really kind of dreaming about the future. And we're at the starting line, and it's really hard to say what might happen when you're at the starting line of something so massive. But here's one thing that I will say, that we're not putting the genie back in the bottle, and artificial intelligence is actually going to change what it means to be human. Now, let me qualify that because people get very nervous when I say things like this. In the mind of God, when God says in Genesis chapter 1, be fruitful, multiply, fill the earth, the cultural mandate that he gives to Adam and Eve, I don't think that God simply had in mind, make a bunch of babies and eat a lot of fruit. Like, that's not the extent to which he was commanding them to fill and subdue or manage the earth. He was calling us to fill it with meaning. God foresaw espresso machines and cruise ships and NASCARs, and he saw nanotechnology and, video games. None of this is a surprise to God. It was all in the mind of God. And as we make meaning, we actually fill the earth with the glory of God. And as we make meaning, we actually fulfill God's creative intent that he started in the garden. He started in a garden, and it's going to end in a garden state, the integration of a city and a garden. And in between those two realities, there are all of these massive evolutions of what it actually means to be human. We think of the Roman road. We think of the printing press. I think artificial intelligence is probably exponentially more important than anything that we've actually created before. And it's going to change what it means to be human in this way. I think it's actually going to restore some of what was lost in the garden. That doesn't mean that AI is our co-redemptor. We wouldn't say anything as heretical as that. Jesus is our redemptor. Jesus is making all things new. Jesus is restoring all things. But wouldn't we say as Christians that he's done so through the creation of antibiotics, the creation of air transportation, like the kinds of things that we've made, from symphonies to, mass transit, to all the things that we've made have actually changed what it actually means to be human. A human being, I'm going to get on a plane in a couple weeks. I'm going to go from Detroit, Michigan to Seoul, South Korea in 14 hours, and I'm going to have a lived experience with 6,000 people, Christian leaders, at a conference called the Lausanne Conference. That was not possible a few, generations ago. The lived human experience is different. So, but what I mean by it's going to change what it means to be human is that the lived human experience is going to be so profoundly enhanced through artificial intelligence that we won't even be able to conceive of what it was like to have lived without artificial intelligence. And again, I don't think we're going to call it artificial intelligence in the future. I think that's a redundancy. It's an intelligence, and these large language models are showing all kinds of behavior. In fact, I think people are actually beginning to wonder about God's intervention in some of these large language models. I talked to several tech people at the AI4 conference, and they're wondering, is there something, and these are people who aren't religious people. Is there something in this large language model that's mystical, that's beyond coding? Is there something that's, emergent behavior? They're using language like that. We know as believers that, this is, I think, the Bible passage that parallels that. Paul comes to, the intelligentsia of his day, and He perceives all of these statues, all of these idols to every possible god. And there's even one to an unknown God. And he says, well, what's unknown to you, I'm here to proclaim. And so God is at work in the meaning making of the creation of generative artificial intelligence. And what the future holds, who knows what it's going to hold. But we can be sure of one thing. If this is the beginning, the integration of generative AI is going to actually change everything. And that has incredible consequences on the negative, because we create broken things.
Yep.
Think about the internet itself. The internet exists today as it is primarily because of pornography and video games. The technology that was created wouldn't exist if it wasn't for those two things driving traffic to the early web, right? And so is generative AI going to be used for equally, it's going to be used for wickedness and exploitation, but it is also a spinning world of wonder. It is also something that is beautiful and meaningful and has the potential to create human flourishing on a scale that is really unprecedented. So, and then the last thing, Mark, you asked about the opportunities that generative AI will present for the gospel. I think radio, television, and the internet combined are not going to come close to the potential that generative AI has for the proclamation of the gospel. What that's going to look like, lots of people are dreaming that. I met a couple of believers at the AI4 conference who have companies who are engaged in scripture translation through generative AI, Bible studies and discipleship through AI, all kinds of ways in which believers are beginning to think about how to deploy AI in disciple making across the globe.
I think that's one of the things that is incredibly interesting, is this idea of a guide that comes alongside of people, especially those who are new in the faith, and is able to walk with them with a great deal of confidence to help us take truths and concepts and stories and poetry and wisdom literature that's thousands of years old, and help translate those things, not just language wise, but culturally, historically, technologically, be able to translate those things into 2024 in a way that we have somebody that we can walk through some of that with. And I know that, in many cases, people say, well, you're supposed to do that with somebody else. And I totally agree with that. I totally agree with doing that with somebody else. But the availability of being able to tap into that and to have just to have something to walk through that with you, man, just a pastor, that's exciting to me. And certainly as somebody who sees a deep value in digital space and what can happen in it, instead of just writing it off as, it's all going to hell and we're not going to go with it. So we're getting off of all those things. To recognize the redemptive story arc that God is writing into it. Man, God has taken things that are very broken and written beautifully redemptive stories into them. And I believe that in the case of the internet, in the case of the video game community, the case of the nerd culture, and then also in the case of what we're seeing here with generative AI, that God has the ability and the desire to write some redemptive story arc into what it is that we're creating, which is super powerful. Well, York, thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate you, and we're super pumped to have you at NCMS this year.
Can't wait to see you.
Yeah. And if you're listening in and you have not registered for Nerd Culture Ministry Summit yet, it's not too late. There's only a handful of housing options left at the castle, but there are tickets left. So if you'd like to come, we're going to be in Colorado Springs, Colorado this November for Nerd Culture Ministry Summit 2024. You can go to ncmsummit.com and check it out, or grab the link that goes along with these show notes and get registered today. It's not a super expensive conference, and it's going to be awesome. We have really great keynote speakers, some great workshops, a great opportunity to come and find your tribe. Yeah, like one of the guys we just had on is a board game designer doing redemptive things inside of the board gaming industry, a designer of some really awesome games. And come and hang out with them. Come and hang out with York. Come and hang out with us. So we'll see you at Nerd Culture Ministry Summit this November. That's going to do it for this episode of the NCMU podcast. We'll see you guys in the next episode.